everyone, and thank you for joining us for the latest installment of the Payne Institute podcast. We're joined with Dr. Nicole Smith. She's the assistant professor at the Colorado School of Mines. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Smith.
Thank you for having me.
A lot of your research focuses on resources and communities. Could you give a little background on a high level on why this is a growing issue?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of background about who I am and my position at Mines, and that can lead into my research and why it's important. So I'm actually a cultural anthropologist, and I sit in the mining engineering department. I have a tenure track faculty position in the mining engineering department. And one of the reasons why the mining engineering department brought me in was because of these increasing conflicts between natural resource development and communities. And there have been a couple studies in the past 2 years, I believe. Ernst & Young has produced some studies that state that one of the highest risks or the highest risk to mining developments moving forward is social license to operate. So there's a growing recognition that community opposition to mining projects is one of the greatest risks. So I think we see in the past decade or so, we see this growing awareness from the public and from communities where mining operations are taking place, that mining operations maybe in the past haven't been done with communities' needs in mind necessarily. And I think there's been a perspective in general that communities will benefit from a mining development, but after the mining development starts turning a profit. So kind of these passive beneficiaries. Whereas I think that communities and, the civil society, NGOs, and even consumers are asking for more accountability from mining companies and more contributions to communities in a way that contribute to sustainable development. And with the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, I believe in 2012, 2015, somewhere around there, I believe with the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the extractive industries were specifically called on to make more sincere contributions to sustainable development in and around the communities where they operate. So we see this attention to the role that extractive industries can play in sustainable development. We see this recognition occurring at very high levels, the UN on down to local communities. And so I think, in terms of from a company's perspective, the growing issues between resources and communities can really impact a company's social license to operate and their ability to move a mine plan forward. We know that conflict with community can cost mining companies a lot of money. And so from a mining company's perspective, it's sort of necessary to determine how they can work with communities and work towards promoting and supporting sustainable development within those communities. I think also that investors and shareholders are paying more attention to this as a potential liability. And so on many different levels, relationship between natural resource developments and communities is becoming more central. And companies are recognizing more and more that they have this significant role to play in sustainable development and working with communities to help their social license to operate.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I think for a lot of people, they kind of originally viewed social license as, kind of getting permission. But now, like you're saying, with these new motivators such as consumers and investors, we're seeing it shift towards much more communal involvement, like you were saying, and contributing to communities. And I think that's great, and I think it's a logical step. As you mentioned earlier, the mining industry has a lot of history with environmental degradation and communal problems. So I think it's great that they're moving towards this. And You mentioned kind of some different aspects of it, and from your research, you're also involved into a lot of different issues surrounding the subject. Can you explain, maybe why this multifaceted approach is working well, or maybe some of the different research projects you're doing and how they kind of contribute to this overall idea?
Sure. So I think when we think about the relationship between natural resource developments and communities, it's important to look at and understand the entire supply chain. And the mineral supply chain in the past has had issues with transparency and responsibility. And so I think looking at it from essentially mine to consumer is a really productive way of thinking about how we can address responsibility in this supply chain. So at Mines, at the Colorado School of Mines, there are several initiatives that really address certain aspects of the supply chain, and taken together, I feel like we're taking a pretty holistic look at the supply chain. And so, for example, my colleagues in the mining engineering department are much more focused on sort of the technical aspects of mineral development and production, mining operations and production. But there are significant sustainability elements built into that. How can we produce more materials with less environmental damage? How can our processing be more efficient? And how do we manage tailings? All of these issues kind of at the mine site. We have a really strong program looking at that. And then when we start kind of moving downstream from production, yes, our mining engineering department is we have a large focus on large scale mining, so large corporate scale multinational mining companies work in large scale mines, but we also have a sort of a sub emphasis on this artisanal and small scale mining sector, and this is a hugely important sector for mineral resources in that a lot of our metals and materials come from this sector. Whether this sector operates formally or informally, we still are getting a lot of materials from this sector. So we have a significant group at Mines who's working with artisanal and small scale gold miners. And some of the projects that include this perspective are the NSF funded Partnerships and International Research and Education Project that we call Responsible Mining Resilient Communities. And so that's an interdisciplinary project with multiple faculty from engineering education, social science, and so on that are looking at artisanal and small scale gold mining, in particular in Colombia and Peru, and kind of trying to understand artisanal and small-scale gold mining communities and how can we support them and work with them in becoming formalized, in cleaner practices, safer practices, and so on. So we have kind of, we have a significant thrust of large-scale mining and making that more sustainable and thinking about corporate social responsibility in that corporate sector. But then we also have a significant group who's looking at this other sector of mining that's done more by local people, often operates informally, less technologically advanced, and so on. And then we sort of have, another project or another initiative through the Center for Mining Sustainability, which is a partnership between Universidad Nacional de San Agustin and Arequipa, Peru. And that those projects are really focused. We have a significant water theme. So looking at contaminated water, how do we, what are some ways that can safely and efficiently degrade cyanide from mine impacted waters? There's a significant geohazards component. There's a significant geophysics component. So really looking at sort of the environmental and geological components of mining activities to move these activities. And these are both directed at large and small scale operators. How can we think about moving these into, supporting them to move into a more sustainable realm, not only for, when you think of sustainability, kind of people environment, and profit, in a sense, if we think of those three sectors, or three kind of themes of sustainability. So those projects are really focused on integrating those, again, with this interdisciplinary approach. And then we've had some other projects and an ongoing project in Peru looking at illicit supply chains. So thinking, even further downstream from the mine and production to traders and buyers and supply chains, and how can we understand supply chains? Where can we understand these illicit, or where can we identify these illicit components? And then what potential models can we create that could potentially disrupt some of those illicit components? So again, really, I think that the benefit that we have at Mines is that we have, social scientists, engineers, and kind of applied scientists really looking at these problems from different angles. And I think that's what it takes to not only understand, but to transition mining into a more sustainable practice. And I think we benefit from having all those different perspectives at Mines. And we also benefit because we're taking a large view of the supply chain. We have the Payne Institute who's looking at policies. So, top down thinking, how can policies be better written and enacted that address what's really going on the ground, and how can the engineering kind of from the bottom up and the social science from the bottom up work to support communities and industry in cleaner, safer practices and more responsible supply chains. So I think we have all these fascinating projects going on at Mines that are linked through this common goal of or common question of how can mineral supply chains be more responsible, more transparent, and more sustainable.
Thank you for laying that out. And I think you made, a lot of great points about, how different areas kind of play into each other. And I think that's something that we forget, and more downstream and maybe even from the policy side. There's a lot of moving parts to this. You have, the large multinational mining companies, you have the artisanal miners, then you have supply chains from both of those, and you have global value chains. Things are being shipped across the world, and
right.
And it's a complicated issue. It's not cut and dry at all. You also mentioned formalizing artisanal small scale mining, which I think is something that it would be great to learn a little bit more about. I mean, a lot of people, when you mention artisanal small scale mining, they kind of just shrug their shoulders. They're not sure what to do with it, especially industry players. They're like, yeah, there's people that are mining, but they're not us, and they're only mining small quantities. But I went to one of your talks one time. I think you mentioned a very surprising statistic about how much gold comes from artisanal small scale mining. And, we all know about the DRC and then cobalt, but could you maybe tell us a little bit more about why it's important to formalize ASM and maybe how big of a deal it is? Because I think a lot of people aren't quite as aware.
Sure. So it's a huge sector. I mean, globally, I think that exact numbers are difficult to achieve or difficult to obtain because many of the miners and people in the sector do work informally. But, there are estimates that up to 100 million people in the world rely to some extent on artisanal and small scale mining, whether they're mining themselves directly or whether they're supporting the supply chain by providing goods and services to miners or mineral processors, whether they're buying gold, whether they're traders, so there's all of these different aspects of the supply chain. So in the developing world where most of these activities take place, it's a huge source of income for people. And I think there's a recognition by governments of these countries that it's not going to go away, and it's a livelihood for people. And if they were to banish it altogether, that it would contribute to even more poverty, and that this is a sector that shouldn't be eliminated. But I think that the need is to move. So we kind of have a couple different things at play here. We do have small scale miners who are operating formally, and our work in Peru works with a couple of those small scale mining companies that have been formalized. and are selling their gold under gold certification schemes like Fairmind and EcoGold, which are gold certification schemes created by the Alliance for Responsible Mining based out of Colombia. But essentially, that helps to ensure this more kind of transparent, responsible supply chain. So we have this good example of small scale companies that have become formalized. Why it's important to become formalized, I think, is partially for legitimacy in terms of, the people we talk to in Peru say, we want to become formalized so we're not harassed by the government. So they can't take away our equipment. So they can't take away our gold. And so on one hand, you have this need for becoming formalized. So there aren't, interdictions against small scale miners and things like that. On the other hand, it can kind of serve as a double-edged sword, because a lot of the people we talk to are say, well, once we're formalized, we're sort of under the microscope of the government. It gives them a reason to come and inspect us in more detail, and we're not getting the support we need necessarily. So I think we found in Peru is that miners have become formalized, but the support that they were promised from the government hasn't accompanied formalization. So that's one gap. And I know that wasn't necessarily the question, but I think moving miners into formalization, one, it helps for legitimacy in terms of them not feeling like they're harassed by the government, which, as I mentioned, there's sort of that other side to it. Two, there's a significant environmental component when miners become formalized. And every country is different in terms of the policies and regulations for miners to become formalized, but there's usually some kind of environmental impact assessment or some kind of environmental plan that miners have to put in place to make sure that either they're disposing of their tailings correctly in an environmentally sensitive way, or they're if they are using mercury, they're using it in a safe way, or they're not using mercury if the country has banned mercury, and so on. And so I think there's formalizing, also has these significant environmental implications. And then I also think there are significant social implications. So mines that become formalized, for example, in Peru, the owners are required to supply health insurance to their employees. There's specific rules for, how many hours people can work. And so it really, and PPE, personal protective equipment, is often required from formalization regulations. And so, there's kind of these three areas. One is sort of legitimacy with the government. Two is environmental protections. And three is kind of these social labor protections. And then another benefit of formalization from the miners' perspective is that it connects them with markets. So it connects them with more viable markets through which they can sell their gold, more legitimate markets. And once miners become formalized, then potentially they're able to gain those certifications I mentioned, Fairmind, there's Fair Trade Gold, there's EcoGold, and those give them a higher premium for their gold. So it's similar to the Fair Trade coffee model where, they're connected with buyers, and so they're able to get more money for selling their gold. So in some ways, and as I spoke about, there are issues with how formalization is enacted in many countries. There are gaps between what's required of miners and the actual on-the-ground reality of what miners are able to achieve, given the resources that they have. But I think that moving them into a more formal sector provides a certain amount of protections for them, at the local level that can be really beneficial.
Thank you. No, that makes sense. And I think you made some great points about, how much of a complex issue. It seems like it can be very progressive if it's done correctly, but, ensuring that they get the benefits that they need from formalization and that they don't suffer for it and that they have access to these, these positive changes is is difficult and probably also unique for every country and every country's concern. You mentioned mercury a lot, which is, of course, a huge environmental concern in Peru. And from my research in the Congo and the DRC, they have a lot of problems with, hand mining ore and selling it to markets and, getting paid pennies for what is essentially, a valuable commodity. So, yeah, it's troubling. So
it is a complex issue, and even you mentioned from country to country, and even within countries, it's so different. And my work primarily has taken place in Peru over the past 5 years, and mining in the Amazon basin and in the Department of Madre de Dios is very different from mining in the high Andes in the Department of Puno, and so super different dynamics. And a lot of countries have tried to decentralize formalization so that regional governments really take the lead in formalizing. What we're finding is I personally believe that's a good strategy, but it appears that regional governments aren't given the resources to regulate once they do formalize miners, and they're not given resources to support miners by going out to the field, for example, having engineers go out to the field and work with miners to improve their practices and work with them in completing the environmental impact assessments before they even become formalized. So again, there's this gap in decentralization efforts, although I think it's a step in the right direction, because we see that even within country, mining sites vary greatly depending on where you are and what kind of ore and what kind of deposit you're mining.
Do you think that industry might play a role in help with the decentralization problem and maybe that gap? And maybe, you were talking earlier about how a lot of these, larger mining companies are looking to be more involved with communities. And it seems like these are neighboring communities also involved in the mining industry that might benefit from that support. How do you view the larger international mining companies kind of playing a role in this?
That's a great question. In recent years, there's been a lot of talk in industry and in academia about coexistence between large scale and artisanal and small scale mining. And so this idea is that what has happened in a lot of countries is that governments will grant a mining concession to a large scale mining company. And then the large scale mining company, while they're doing exploration or in the course of their development, they find that there's a population of small scale miners working on their concession already, or they'll get granted a concession that word will get around. There's word, there's gold here. And so people will move into that area to start mining. So there have been a lot of conflicts between the large scale mining sector and artisanal and small scale mining. But I think we're looking for some good examples of coexistence, and some models that have been tried are some companies have tried to allocate portions of their concessions for small scale mining. Some companies have set up processing facilities where they'll process the ore from small scale miners and then pay them. And so that helps with some of the environmental impacts of small scale mineral processing. And I think that these are, this is a step in the right direction, and that these are good ideas. I think implementation has had issues, and primarily because of trust. The small scale mining sector in general, there's been a lack of trust towards both government and large scale mining companies. And so that has really hampered some of the efforts. For example, with a central processing facility, let's say a small scale miner is bringing their ore to a large scale mining processing facilities. Oftentimes they don't feel like they're getting a fair price, or they don't feel like the company is transparent about how much gold was in the ore. So there are all kinds of these trust issues. But I think the biggest thing to emphasize is that, yes, large-scale mining companies have a significant role to play in working with the sector and supporting the sector. At the same time, government has a significant role as well. And so my feeling is that at the forefront of any project, we should have these three sectors together at the table large scale mining, small scale mining, and government, and allocating responsibilities, discussing a plan, alongside of kind of the mining plan that the large scale mining company is considering. So I think, it's yes, large scale mining companies have a significant role to play, but I don't think that's possible without government support as well of both sectors. And governments generally kind of weigh in on the side of large scale mining because of the royalties and taxes and so on. But again, they recognize that there's a huge small scale mining sector and that they have a responsibility to support that sector as well. So I think this sort of trifecta of government, large scale mining, and small scale mining working together to think about how coexistence can really look in a way that's feasible. That process can also help build trust in the beginning of a project. And, I'm talking very optimistically. There's always issues, but I think having dialogue and conversations and planning from the very beginning of a mine project is really important for moving forward with any kind of coexistence.
No, thank you. And that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to see how that dynamic is going to play out. I loved how you kind of condense it to the three sectors, the large scale, small scale, and the government. And, from a policy perspective, I think we're always curious about, how we get there and who the players are and what we can do next to make it happen. And in that sense, do you have any idea on what maybe the future of ASM might look like? Just theoretically, hypothetically, no one's going to quote you and hold you to it.
Right. I think most idealistically, in my most optimistic thinking, or in an ideal world, it would be a legitimate, so formalized sector that's mining and processing their minerals environmentally responsibly, with adequate or more than adequate protections in place for human health and safety, labor benefits for miners, and sort of, I don't think it's going to exactly mimic what a large scale company's operations look like, but I do think that there are, lessons that the sector can learn from large scale mining. And we see this in Peru with some of the formalized small scale mining operators that we work with. They have a central dining hall and all the miners and employees get fed breakfast, lunch, dinner if they're working long shifts. And, and then they have, the proper signage. And we see a lot of this mimicking large scale mining operations. So I think there's a lot to learn there. But I think in an ideal world, we have a thriving sector that is linked to consumers through responsible and transparent supply chains, and that workers and employees are safe and have insurance, get paid fair wages, and so on. And so I think, it's perhaps idealistic. I think that if we look on the micro scale, there are ways that we can create these mini supply chains potentially that have that transparency and that responsibility built in. Another thing I do want to mention is yes, kind of this trifecta of government, large scale mining, and small scale mining, but there's a real role for NGOs to play in this. And, as I mentioned, the NGO Alliance for Responsible Mining, they manage some of these gold certification schemes. And so I think that their role is often underestimated because often they have good relationships and have the trust of local communities. And so I think that their involvement is also key in bridging some of that gap between not only consumers and mined products from the small scale mining sector, but working with miners directly. They've got, programs on mercury safety and so on, and educational materials. And there's so many resources that they have, in terms of, educational resources, training resources, but also that social capital, those relationships with communities and miners that can be so important. So I would maybe edit my trifecta to be a quad quadfecta where we have, civil society NGOs, we have communities, we have government and large scale mining companies at the table.
And then public policy is in there somewhere, right?
Yes. Well, that's kind of with government, right? I think maybe public policy comes out of those conversations, and yeah.
No, it makes sense, and I don't think your hypothetical view of the future was too optimistic at all. I think it's very reasonable, to expect that there's these smaller kind of safe and healthy people working towards a very old profession. I think the idea of these multinational mining giants it's nice because it's grown with industrialization, but it's not necessary, and they haven't contributed as much to, I mean, they have, society's been built upon these large material needs, but they also have their own history of environmental degradation. They have their own struggles and their own problems with governments and formalization. So I think it's not unrealistic to expect that these smaller mining communities could also just become more stable and more healthy and sustainable. And I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when a man can feed his family if he's a small gold miner in Peru or something. That's an old profession. So
right.
I liked your view on it.
And I think that the large scale companies have so many resources, and in terms of material resources, but also knowledge resources, that there's a real opportunity to train miners and mineral processors in more environmentally sustainable, socially responsible practices. Inevitably, I think there are some members of the small scale mining sector that would look for jobs in large scale mining. I think there are some that wouldn't, but I think large scale mining has a role to play in that too as well, in terms of providing training and resources for the small scale mining with this kind of goal of, yes, the sector needs to be more sustainable on its own, but also how can we provide advanced resources and skills to members of this population so that they can, if they want to, get jobs in large scale mining operations that are located around where they live, and advance kind of through that, advance up the hierarchy of sort of the corporate hierarchy, or, so I think there's a real opportunity as well to train and work with local operators in large scale mining as well.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense when, we were talking about, social license and kind of this community involvement. That's a lot of what I think the sustainable development goals are. Yeah, how can we improve the lives of these communities beyond just the basic traditional sense, teaching them technical skills, giving them jobs that last maybe beyond even the mine site. But, and part of that is like you were saying, getting them more involved in these industry developments and making it more dynamic and impactful. And I think that also makes sense when you consider, that a lot of these artisanal and small scale goods that are mined or commodities that are mined, they still end up in large supply chains. They're still being bought by a lot of these companies in Africa. And,
right.
It's still, the more you can formalize it and the more you can help them and the more transparent you are, all these pieces coming together kind of, I think, helps everybody in a sense. And thank you for working towards that. And thanks for all your great research at Mines. Do you have any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to tell people that maybe they get more involved, or how they could, be a little more conscious about their supply chains or artisanal miners?
Well, I think the consumers have a big role to play. I know it's challenging. Like, even as a consumer, we don't know where the gold in our phones comes from, and because the mineral and metal supply chain is different in terms of the lack of sort of branding of these materials. So, for example, oil and gas, BP's extracting oil and you see BP gas stations, right? So there's this direct brand that links consumer activities to production in a way. But with mining, we don't have that. We don't know where our mining, I buy a gold ring and I usually have no idea where it comes from. There are, companies and initiatives that are providing more legibility in terms of where their materials are coming from. So I think as consumers, we have a role to play in trying to understand where our materials are coming from. Of course, tracking down the materials in my cell phone might not be that easy, but I think the awareness that coltan, cobalt is coming from the DRC and is mined in suboptimal conditions, I think it starts with that consumer awareness in terms of what we can all do as individuals and thinking about how we can direct our resources, our money, essentially, to products that might have more transparent and responsible supply chains. And I know it's not easy, but I think it's something that we could all maybe try a little bit harder to do and to think about.
Yeah, I definitely will. I know that I'm going to start being more conscious. I can't afford Nicole yet because I work in public policy, but
yeah, that's right. I hear the same.
Yeah, but no, thank you for your time and thank you for explaining some of these concepts, and thank you in general.
Yeah.
I'll see you around campus.
Thanks for having me, Jordy. It's been a pleasure, and we can follow up with anything else.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.